Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Kristen Dorr. I'm the Integro webinar moderator. If you're new to Integro or our webinar series, hello and welcome. We're really glad to have you. We host webinars once a month. We keep them 30 minutes, so it's a quick and hopefully valuable use of your time. And if you're one of our ride or die webinar attendees, thank you for joining us and always participating in these events with Integro. We appreciate you and we see you. On the line with me today, I have Jason Brandis. He's the VP of Consulting here at Integro, and he's also one of the founding members of Integro. So he has a lot of experience and knowledge to share with you guys around information governance, enterprise content management. And today, he's going to be talking about migration, a case study that Integro has to share with all of you. Before I hand the mic over to him, just a quick note that you are welcome to ask questions at any time during Jason's presentation. You can do so in the sidebar in the question box, and we will answer all of those questions at the end. So without any further ado, I will let Jason take it away, and I will check in with you guys at the end of his presentation. Jason?
Thanks, Kristen. Again, my name is Jason Brandis. Without further ado, we'll just kind of start the presentation. So one of the goals of this presentation and the agenda is to discuss the capabilities, the initial steps we had to do to set it up, reconciliation, and then what we had to do after each phase. So really just to get into it, the case study is, let's set it up for first case. It was a Fortune 500 company that had a legacy Source 1 email archive with approximately 3 billion emails. The reason that they were looking to migrate off of the system of Source 1 is they were using Centera storage, and that was Source 1 was unable to delete any emails. And one of the mandates that came down was the fact that we have only a certain number of users that are on legal hold, and we don't have any reason to keep all of the rest of this data. So the goal was to actually delete that data, and Source 1 was unable to delete single documents. It was keep it in block, especially with Centera, if anybody's familiar with Centera block storage. So after we looked at this, and they first initially looked at doing a native migration using Source 1 utilities, and what they found is it was going to take years and years to migrate. So they went out and started shopping around and actually found Integro as a contractor, and then also found a product called Nuix. So one of the biggest difference, one of the things that Nuix provides is a very fast way of migrating and the ability to delete single emails after it's been migrated. So when we talk about fast data processing, we did this entire migration in 3 phases. The actual extraction from Source 1 for each phase was about 1 billion documents. We were able to extract 1 billion documents on average in 21 to 24 days. Again, this was compared to like a year if we were using the Source 1 API. When we're talking about that, the other thing that Nuix had when it was up for review was a proven track record. They've done numerous of these very large email migrations in a very quick period of time. In addition to that, they had this ability to do tagging. So again, for this company, what they were looking at is saying, we have 10,000 users that are on legal hold, and only those 10,000 users' data is what we want to maintain going into the future. And again, Nuix was able to do this tagging process so that every single email that had anyone on these 10,000 lists could be tagged for retention, and then we could delete everything else. And that's the other thing, is we were able to very quickly able to search, find, and delete this data. So let's talk a little more about the first process, fast data processing. So when we talk about fast data processing, as I just mentioned, we were able to extract 1 billion emails in 21 to 24 days. This does come with a hardware consideration. So the hardware, just to give you an example, this migration was done with 3 servers. They were each 44 cores. They had 512 gigs of memory. They had an ample SAN storage, and each one of them had about five terabyte drives of solid state. And there's a reason for each one of these, and I'll go through this as we go along. This speed also presents other problems. As we said, why Nuix was able to do this, we found the back-end system struggled. So again, we were working on a legacy Centera device that was getting older, and we actually found that we were throttling Nuix down in order to meet what Centera could actually provide. Because at times we were actually pushing so much data through Centera, we could crash the Centera device, which was not efficient. So we actually were throttling it down. So that's one of the considerations that we had. When also we talk about this, the data volumes, when you're looking at processing this data very, very quickly, you have to have the SAN storage to be able to handle it. Again, when we're talking about transferring over hundreds of terabytes of data in 3 weeks, your SAN storage has to be very, very fast, and it has to be local to the Nuix servers. So in this case, we put them all in the same data center. And in this case, we had to move to our disaster recovery center because the volume of data that we were going to be putting over there back would be too high and would affect production. So this entire migration had to be at one single data center. And for us, it was at a disaster recovery data center so that we wouldn't affect production because of the sheer volume of size. The other thing that also has to happen is we have to have local databases. So again, if you're familiar with SourceOne, eVault, Xantaz, they all contain a local database that contains a lot of the information. To go back, especially on SourceOne, when it's archived, the document is archived in its original format, which means if I'm sent to a group, or let's say all IT, the email says all IT, but both SourceOne, eVault, and Xantaz actually keep the expanded distribution for that time. So again, if all IT was 20 different users, we don't want in our new system when we export it out just all IT. We need those 20 users' names, especially when we're talking about putting them on legal hold if they were on a legal hold. And for that case, we do need a local database. We can't go against the original production database because A, it's too slow and it's still being used by production. So the next thing we're looking at is a central location and program. On the central location, we're looking at this metadata tagging. So as I've mentioned so far, we were able to extract this data as long as we had an ample storage of SAN. We had the Nuix servers running at full capacity. And the other thing we had was, of course, local SQL databases so we could expand their distribution list. On the next portion, we were actually talking about tagging. So we quickly extracted the data, and the next one was to determine which documents were on legal hold. So in this process, again, each phase was taking about 20 days to identify which users were on legal hold. So the client provided Integro with a legal hold list, and then we were able to apply that legal hold list to all billion emails. And again, that took about, the actual applying it took about 10 days, but the entire process took about 20, and I'm going to talk about why that occurred later. What we found when we were tagging these databases, it was important how big your data sets were. So when extracting, there's not really a limit of how big how much you can do. You could do all billion in one great big shot. Not recommended, but it can be done. But what we found for performance reasons, especially when we were looking at tagging of these data sets, is that 12 to 15 million emails in a single data set with 12 indexes was the appropriate amount for the best performance. So again, if you're looking at trying to do a very large email migration, you should be considering those are the batch sizes that you should be looking at. Again, in that case, a single batch was extracting in 24 hours up to 36 hours based upon how big the emails are and what the year we were extracting on. it's also important to realize one of the key things that I just mentioned is very important for metadata tagging, which is this expanded DL. Without it, we could not clearly or cleanly identify what emails. In a lot of very large companies, Fortune 500 companies, distribution lists are used very commonly. So if you're trying to put John Doe at acme.com onto a legal hold list and he's in a group, you have to have that expanded DL when you're extracting the data. And that was the only way we were able to identify all the email that was under John Doe. And then we could simply tag him and effectively identify each email. So the last step in this is actually efficient deletion. So again, we've extracted it, we've tagged it, we've found the users that are still on legal hold, and now we need to be able to delete it. So the key on efficient deletion really is this fact of you have to do a defensible deletion. You have to have a chain of custody. So again, typically it's illegal that's driving this deletion. There's risk in legacy data. And what we're trying to do is do it in an efficient way that still provides a chain of custody. So Nuix has a product called Nuix Collector that actually went through and created deletion lists for us. And in this case, it would go through all the documents that weren't identified as being on legal hold and making lists of each document so it could be tracked. What we kept, what we delete, everything was being tracked. The key on this really is to make those batch sizes, again, reasonable. What we found is you could do entire large batches. You could do 800 million at a time, but the lists were so large it couldn't be open. So you need to make sure that you're making these deletion lists in about 100,000 emails, or you can do it in a very large list, but then you have to build your own splitter to split these files up so they can be clearly identified. In this case, I think it's important, right? We were talking about doing the extraction of 1 billion documents per phase, and then we were tagging those, and then we were deleting them. One of the great benefits that this client was looking for was to reduce its total amount of email, and this whole process was able to do that. The original Source1 archive had approximately 3 billion emails. After they had deleted all of the emails, what they were left with was about 1 billion. So they had reduced 2 billion emails from their legacy email archive system, and they had extracted it. So initial steps. The initial steps are important. How do you accomplish something where you can take 3 billion emails, you can clearly identify what was on legal hold, and then delete everything that wasn't on legal hold in such a timely and quick fashion? And really that it comes up with the initial steps. Nuix is actually going to provide you, if you work with Nuix and Integro, they're going to provide a very detailed questionnaire. And it's important to fill out those questionnaires. The reason is it's got a lot of information and needs to be properly configured for this system to be designed. Well, in this case, we had a very large migration, 3 billion emails with 44 cores and these very large boxes. Yours may not. You may be looking at a 10 terabyte or a 100 terabyte migration. And in all those, there's a definitely size that fits you. This process, we were using physical servers, but you could also use virtualized servers. There's a very strict way you have to configure those to make sure you get your performance. Because in the end, when we're looking at allocating these servers and their storage, it's going to be important that you understand that every single decision you make on that hardware or how it's configured is important to the performance you're going to get in. If you're going to say, oh, look, I saw these great numbers, it was done and designed all starting with that questionnaire and then how those computers were allocated. They have to match kind of what they are, what has been recommended. Because if you go and say, oh, I don't really need solid state drives, I'll just use my standard drives, you won't get the same performance. Because again, as I mentioned before, when we were writing deletions and logs to delete 2 billion emails that were on a list, that has to go to a log file. I'm making a list of 2 billion entries. If I'm putting it out to a standard drive, it will never be able to keep that performance up. And in fact, that's you have 5 terabytes of solid state drives is to keep all of those log files and all of that is written out there to keep the performance up. The other thing that you need to understand is you cannot boil the ocean. This is mentioned in many other processes. We're talking about very large migrations. Do not attempt to try to do all of it in one shot. You should go through a simple POC, a simple test to determine for your system what is the best size. You know, is a batch size, in our case, 12 to 15 million is what we found as being the ideal batch size, or is it maybe closer to a couple million documents in a batch size? You have to break that out into the size that makes sense for your environment and for the hardware that you've acquired. And then the last thing, which is really logistics. These whole things are very complicated. They're very large. Even though they're going quickly, they don't go overnight. It's important to keep your logistics designed from the beginning. What am I tracking? When am I tracking it? How am I tracking it? To make sure that you understand the processes you go through. You should not also expect your process to be inflexible, because what's going to happen is things are going to crash. I think I mentioned at the beginning we had a Centera device where we're running through these very large migrations as fast as we can, and what we found out is we had crashed Centera, and you go, oh, I have to rerun that whole batch. You cannot have such a strict process that you can't be able to rerun it, that you can't go back and be able to do certain portions of it again. And reconciliation. So reconciliation is probably one of the biggest keys to this whole thing. You really have to understand where you're starting and where you're ending. And to get your starting numbers, it's important to realize, I think in this one case, is that Nuix doesn't use the APIs for the actual system. That being said, I have a source one system. The reason we're able to get better performance than doing a standard extraction using source one is Nuix is going directly against the data source. So in this case, we had P files. We were directly hitting the block storage devices in Centera to retrieve them. The drawback to that is the fact that Nuix actually is doing like a forensic pull off of those storage devices, which may or may not occur anywhere else. So how am I going to do reconciliation when I don't know what's coming out? Well, Integro, through this process, we've actually built our own intellectual property that will pull the expected number of documents out of the original source one or eVault databases and actually give you that starting count, because that's going to be very important to any client that you're working with. How am I going to pull out? You tell me that Nuix is going to pull out more than what I supposedly have in there. How do I know? What do I know what to expect when I'm coming out of this migration? And what you're going to have to do is actually go into the original databases and actually pull every single instance of what it says the source one or eVault, what it actually says it archives compared to what it's actually presenting in the API, because they're quite different because of single instance storage in almost all of these applications. Then I do this reconciliation, right? So before you even start, you have to know your target. What is my goal? The next step you have to do, of course, is the migration. Well, then how do I check the migration? The migration on a check is really going to come out. If I'm extracting them out to a file share, or even to another database, I'm going to have to get an exact count. In this case, we were actually extracting all these emails out to a file share. And again, we had to get an exact count. But the problem is when I look at the directories, there's a lot of data in it, and then I try to do searches, or I try to do a Windows and give me a number. They're all effective, but very slow. To give you a good example for reconciliation, when we were talking about, we've extracted these, and now we're trying to get the actual EML count, the actual email message count. We would try to do that in DOS or in Windows, and it could take anywhere from an hour to 3 hours. What we found is the most effective is actually writing PowerShell scripts to go out and find these same things. And instead of taking an hour or 30 minutes for some of the smaller cases, we had it down to 3 to 5 minutes if it's being run in a 64-bit PowerShell. So again, that reconciliation, I have to know what I'm expecting to get, and then I have to be able to check it when I get it out. Then the next step we talk about tagging. The exact same thing. I mentioned before, it took it actually 11 days to tag, but 10 days in total. You have to know what you're expecting when you go into it. So again, Integro, working with the client and working with Nuix, built a way to say, this is how many documents we're expecting to be tagged. This is how many documents we're expecting to not be tagged before you go in. Because again, it's important to test the procedure to make sure that every single step is meeting your requirements, and at the end, we can show a chain of custody all the way from reconciliation to deletion. And then, of course, the reconciliation on the last step is going to be that same concept. I know going in, I'm going to have a deletion count, right? I have these lists. I can get an exact count of how many emails that I'm going to be deleted. But you have to confirm that at the end. First of all, you have to confirm how many are left at the end. And again, using PowerShell, we found was much quicker than any other way. We would have reports. We have these entire lists that we could do before we delete it. So it's not a single step. It's not like, oh yeah, go delete all these emails. We have a list to show chain of custody of what's being deleted. We could get a count from those lists to show this is exactly what we're expecting to delete, and here's how many documents should be left over. And at the end, we could confirm that with PowerShell. This also brings up another thing when we talk about reconciliation. These processes are not perfect, and people, especially clients, are going to listen to some of the numbers and go, oh my gosh, I'm missing 3,000 emails. It's important before you start, when you're planning this, to build and agree to a variance level. In almost in all of Integro's migrations, and we've done hundreds, we talk about doing this, we build a variance of 0.5%. It's not that the system will get close to that. In most cases, we were a fraction of that, hundredths of a percent. But you need a certain percentage saying this is a tolerance. So sometimes they go, oh, look, I had 2,200 emails. Oh, I can't miss those. But it was out of 400 million or out of 100 million. And then you're talking that it's a very small fractional percent. If you don't have that percentage, you're going to have to be tracking down every single email. We always found a reason why an email didn't get migrated or deleted or things like that, but it's just very, very time consuming. And again, if you're trying to move through this process, the client has to accept some level of variance. If it breaks that variance, it may be correct. There may be large sections like in source one where you had it stored on a Centera device where the Centera device had a corrupt sector on it. Okay, I can't change that. And then we can say it had a 1% variance on it. If it's greater than that 0.5% variance, you have to go research it, report on it, and say why. Or rerun it and correct it, which is exactly what we did. Every once in a while, we would have a percentage variance of like 2%. I go, oh, it must have died, or we rebooted it. And again, you're running a lot of these processes at the same time, and you need to be able to check them and understand what your variance is and make sure that you have, before you start, a reporting structure so both the client and you have a reasonable way of getting through this migration. After action reports, things that we were taking away from the system and things like that is small batches. Again, even though you're talking about large data sets and Nuix can just do vast quantities of data very, very quickly, make them smaller batch sizes that you can do proper results on. So again, you're going to have to do reconciliation on every single data set. Doing big ones, it's almost impossible to reconcile it, and therefore, if you had problems, you have to rerun the entire data set. Every process should be compared before and after you start each one. There should be a truing up. You shouldn't do a true up at the end. Too many times we see other clients and other contracting companies, well, here's where we started, here was redone, we have one true up. Every single step should have its own true up and its own reason for reconciliation. And that's going to be key. It builds confidence that the client is saying, yes, we are getting what we're paying for, and it's also easier if there's any issues, you can go back and fix them. And then the last thing was we were able to open up very large data sets. Again, in the end, we were able to index and search the entire phase one, which is, it started with about 1 billion documents. Phase one was the oldest data. And in this case, we were able to open up single indexes and search them that were about 256 million documents. And we could do that with the hardware provided, but there were a lot of issues around that. So again, talking about the right size for the result. Again, we were able to search 256 million emails, but it required that full server. It was requiring a 44 core and 496 gigs of memory. So you need to know how you're going to be using the data at the end. In this case, the data was ingested into another repository, but if you're going to leave it out in a Nuix environment, which is totally acceptable, what you have to do is make sure that your end result is going to match what you want, and make sure that that data set is reasonable for the hardware that you're providing to open it. From my part, that's it. Did we have, Kristen, do we have any questions that were posted?
Hi, Nathan. Yes, we do. Let me give you one of our questions. Question box is open, guys, so feel free to submit your questions now, and I'll start with the first one. What process did you use to find the sweet spot for the number of emails you could batch? Was it trial and error? How was that done?
Yeah, it actually was trial and error, and it became very clear. Probably the first few, every time we did a batch, we started off doing a couple smaller batches and then working our way up to the point where we were taxing the system. I didn't mention this before, but when I say Nuix can tax the system, again, these were big boxes. We had 3 servers, 44 cores, 512 gigs, 5 terabytes for log files that were SSDs. We also, not only just that, you have to tell the network people what you're going to be doing, because our servers would originally be sitting at 90%, and they would be using 98% of their memory, and they were using like full NIC cards. I mean, they would be using a gig E. They would completely be filling that up. So it is somewhat at the beginning, especially when you first start figuring out what your hardware can do, and more importantly, what your legacy repository can do. Don't assume because you have all this horsepower, your legacy repository can also handle that same amount of horsepower to pull it out. Next question.
Awesome. Okay, next question. Where did the tagging come from? The tagging information, was it already associated with the email, or was there additional tagging information that needed to be added to them, and if so, how?
Yeah, so in this case, the client does have to provide that information. So what they would do is they had their legal department go through and identify those users that were on legal hold, and what we were provided was all the variations of their email address. So again, go back to johndoe@acme.com, we have to provide every single variation that could be. So it's jdoe@acme.com, john.doe@acme.com. And when we're talking about searching it and tagging it, we weren't just searching for one term, John Doe. We actually, on average, had anywhere between 4 to 6 variations of their email for each one, and then we would tag it with their network ID. So we had a standard naming convention for all of those. And that list was converted into something that that Nuix could use by Integro.
Awesome, Jason. Thank you. That's all the questions we have today. Jason, thanks for this fantastic presentation. To all those on the line, thank you for joining us. Jason, I'll let you close it out. We are at the half-hour mark.
Thank you, everybody, again for joining. And again, if you have any questions or are interested in a large migration, please give us a call. I would be happy to answer any of your questions and or work with you in the future. Thank you.